Hello, AP Worlders. We're almost done. One more to go after this one. So I guess two more. But this is decolonization. Known as decolonization or the struggle for independence, this was a dramatic change in the world's politics. These newly freed people in places in Africa, in Asia, right? Remember the people that we learned about during the revolutions era that were imperialism. All right, so now they're going to become free, and they're going to face enormous challenges. All right, one, their legacies of being part of the empire. Second challenge is their own deep divisions within their people, right, from language, ethnicity, religion, and class. Because remember, the Europeans are the ones that drew these borders, so a lot of these places are going to have divisions. Three, rapidly growing population. Four, competing demands of the Cold War, right? So Russia and the United States are both going to be competing for them to either be capitalist or communist. And then last, five, the difficult task of building a modern economy and stable governments. The first breakthrough was in the 1940s when the Philippines, India, Pakistan, Burma, Indonesia, Syria, Iraq, Jordan, and Israel achieved their independence. The era from the 1950s to the 1970s saw the African independence. All right, so you can see some of the year. And then in the 1970s, islands in the Pacific, such as Samoa, they're not on here, but they'll be out here. Samoa, Fiji, are going to receive Tonga are going to receive their independence. Finally, a number of the Caribbean societies, which also is not on this map, but the Bahamas, Barbados, Jamaica, etc., they're going to achieve their independence during the 60s and the 70s, 1960s and 70s. Some new states formed by the dissolvement of former countries. The Austrian and Ottoman empires are going to collapse during World War I, giving rise to a number of new states in Europe and the Middle East. Some areas, although not formally colonized, sought to fight off the influence of colonizing places. For example, the Mexican Revolution was to kick out most of the American-owned businesses. Cuba also kicked out U.S. influence when Fidel Castro took over. The same is also going to occur to the Soviets in some of their areas in the Soviet Union. How to explain decolonization? One theory is the fundamental thoughts contradicted each other. All right, so the thought that Christianity, Enlightenment thought, and material progress kind of all contradicted each other with colonization and exploitation. So they felt like a moral obligation. Or it could have been the world wars had weakened Europe and discredited the European moral superiority so much. All right, soldiers from the colonies would fight side by side with the Europeans, and that way they would then want to fight for their own independence. Or third, it was the creation of the United Nations. That also goes against colonization. Or fourth, many of the citizens of these colonies went off to receive Western educations, and they're going to return to the colonies seeking independence. These leaders are going to be known as fathers, similar to how the United States had the founding fathers. All right, some leaders of note, we have Nehru and Gandhi in India, Sukarno in Indonesia, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, Nkrumah in Ghana, and Mandela in South Africa. Some places, the struggles for independence was in a few years, like the Congo took about 4 years. Some others took multiple years or decades. Some used peaceful political pressure, demonstrations, strikes, mass mobilization, and negotiations. Others had armed struggles to become free. India was among the first to achieve independence, and it provided a model of inspiration to others. All right, so let's look at India a little closer. In 1885, a group of English-educated Indians formed the Indian National Congress, or the Congress Party. Originally, the group sought greater inclusion within the political, military, and business life of the British. They weren't actually seeking independence. They had a hard time gaining a mass following because they were considered the elites in India. But after World War I, things changed. The British had offered a gradual development of self-governing for India if they had helped the British win World War I. But after the war, the British failed to keep their promises. And that is when Gandhi came on the scene in India. Gandhi developed a political philosophy known as Siddhartha, or Truth Force. It was a confrontational but nonviolent approach to political action. Gandhi was able to unite the masses in India by reaching to the Muslims, the women, the untouchables. Not all in India were on the same page, though. Some argued against women and untouchables gaining rights. The biggest opposition, though, came from the Muslims of India, who formed the Muslim League, which contradicted the Congress Party, though they represented everyone. The Muslim League was led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He argued the parts of India with a dominant Muslim presence should be separated. They called it Pakistan, they called it Pakistan, land of the pure. And when the British announced they were leaving after World War I, India was divided into Pakistan, which is here. And 12 million refugees are going to move from one country to join the other. Bangladesh is also going to have a similar beginning as well. Next, we're going to look at South Africa. South Africa's independence is going to be different than India. Independence in South Africa was early. It was in 1910. But the power was given to a government controlled by the white settler minority that remained there. They were actually less than 20% of the population. The country's black African majority had no political rights whatsoever. So black South Africans' struggle was against an internal opponent. So India was against an external opponent in Britain, but the black South Africans were actually revolting against the internal white South Africans who had control. The political dominant white group was known as the Boers or Afrikaners. The Boers or Afrikaners were the Dutch descendants. You might remember they fought the Boer War, the Dutch versus the British, because they both were claiming South Africa. Africans wouldn't gain rule until 1994. Due to the white settlers in power in South Africa had developed because they had white settlers there, they were one of the few places in Africa that developed a mature industrial economy, but it was controlled by the white settlers. The white ruler created a system to control the black South Africans. The system was known as apartheid. It attempted to separate blacks from whites in every way possible, such as social segregation, creating native reserves for them to live in. The African National Congress was developed to try to fight these. All right, so just like you might remember in this, in the early part of the South of the United States, how they had segregated bathrooms and stuff. All right, they had the same here in South Africa. It was actually even worse because there was only like certain areas that the black South Africans could live. The African National Congress was made up of a Western-educated group of Africans who sought more acceptance, not to overthrow. So that was similar to the group in India. In the 50s, a younger group came to lead the group, including Nelson Mandela. All right, that's not a picture when he was younger, but the attempt to use civil disobedience. They attempted to use civil disobedience, such as boycott strikes, to bring change. The government of South Africa responded with tremendous repression. The party was seen as illegal, and they were either killed or thrown in jail. The movement became an underground movement. But growing from the internal pressure, South Africa also faced internal pressure due to the system, or international pressure due to the system of apartheid. South Africa became isolated from the rest of the West. The internal and external pressure led to the release of Nelson Mandela from jail, and eventually he's going to be elected as the president in 1994, ending apartheid. Both India and South Africa faced division, but in India it was based on religion. In South Africa, it was based on race. Africa had many nationalist heroes throughout the country. One of the first was this guy right here, Kwame Nkrumah. He was from Ghana. He believed if they sought political freedom, all other things would follow, such as industrial and economic growth. The countries were known as third world countries or developing nations, but they believed that they were free, they would be able to rise up to a developed country. And at first there was a lot of optimism, but it didn't last long. It became disappointment. All of these developing nations attempted to create order once free, had to contend with some problems. First problem was populations were exploding, and expectations for independence were high. Or second, expectations for independence was high. Third, they were often exceeding their available resources, so they didn't have enough resources for the amount of people. And fourth, they were culturally diverse, and it was hard to bring them all together. India was one of the few places that was able to create a Western-style democracy. Some states are going to make a one-party state, or a single party, or that's one single party that forms the government. Some turn to dictatorship, others have military regimes ruled, and others are going to become communist states. But as the countries perform economically poorly, many would withdraw their support from the government, and it would cause further resentment from the privileged and the relatively well-educated elites who were able to get high-paying jobs. These grievances often found expressed in ethnic conflicts such as Rwanda or the Sudan. Developing countries also had to deal with the changing culture of the West. Things like feminism, rock and rap, secular permissiveness, consumerism, and democracy. These were all things that were going on in the West that these new free places had to deal with. A common theme was how were they going to deal with it. The traditionalists didn't want it, but then there were a group that wanted a modernist who did want to change. So it was a big clash between the two. So how can a traditional modern medicine man relate to these modern hospitals? This really hit hard in the Islamic world, and we're going to look at Turkey and Iran to see how they handle it differently. Turkey was formed by Mustafa Ataturk following the demise of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. Ataturk sought to transform his country into a modern, secular, and national state. To do this, they had to enter the European civilization completely. He wanted to remove Islam from public life and only do it in private life. He ended the caliphate, and Turkey became a republic. Secular law codes modeled on those of Europe replaced the Sharia law. He even changed the style of dress for Turkish men, and many elite women abandoned the veil. Polygamy was abolished, women granted equal rights in divorce and inheritance, and women even had the right to vote and hold office. Iran, on the other hand, had a very different way of dealing with the new Western culture. Iran, under the Shah, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, developed into a modern country. They had great wealth in oil, a powerful military, a well-educated elite, and a solid alliance with the U.S. They redistributed the land to the peasants. Women had the right to vote, and health care and education were on the rise. Traditionalists, though, started to feel threatened by these Western goods and these secular education programs. A high-ranking Shia cleric, Ayatollah Khomeini, led the movement against this change. And what followed was a cultural movement that was the complete opposite of that of Turkey. The new government was an Islamic republic with an elected parliament and a constitution, but really in practice they were conservative Islamic clerics who were headed and led by Khomeini, and they had a dominant power. They moved the country to Sharia law and ended the secular law codes that the previous regime had. Colleges were closed for 2 years while new textbooks, curriculum, and faculty were purified to teach back to Sharia law. Elementary and secondary schools would give priority to religious instruction. Women were now required to cover from head to toe with hijabs. Sexual segregation was imposed in many places in public. Married women couldn't go to school or get divorces, but women could vote, and there were more employment and high education. After Khomeini's death, some elements of this revolution eased a bit, but they were the opposite. All right, so just Turkey and Iran were the opposite. Turkey opened up to Western ideas. Iran did at first, but then they tried to end it. All right, these are things for Western culture, like fast food, things like that. All right, so that's it for the decolonization.